Welcome to the Threats and Trends podcast. Today, I am joined by one of the top authorities in the defense space. He covers everything from arms sales to procurement. He's a must follow on Twitter. If you aren't following him already, ladies and gentlemen, it is Colby Badhwar. Colby, how's it going? I did pronounce that correct, did I?
You did, yes. No, very good. And you didn't even ask me beforehand, so that's.
I was about to say, I was kicking myself. I was like, I should have asked that.
No, you did surprisingly well. So thank you so much for having me on your program. It's much appreciated.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for joining. For those who are watching that have not already followed you, do you mind introducing yourself and kind of describe what you cover primarily on Twitter?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, my name is Colby Badhwar. I reside in Toronto, Canada, and I write about defense and foreign policy. Is what I usually tell people when they ask me what I write about. So I write for a few different publications, active on Twitter, of course, but I do formerly write for The Insider, which a lot of people in North America haven't heard of because it's based in Europe. It's based in Latvia. But I write for Insider, which is actually a Russian language publication founded by Roman Dobrokhodov, who's sort of a Russian opposition figure. And Insider's focus is sort of a lot of criminology and investigative work on what the Russian military intelligence is up to around the world. So even for people that aren't familiar with Insider, you've probably seen some of our investigative work, whether it's on Havana syndrome or just all the assassinations and other nefarious activities that the Russians are up to in Europe and around the world. So right for them, of course, I'm not on the investigative team. I do sort of analysis for them about the war in Ukraine primarily. But that's Insider. And then I also write for Defense Archives, which is a small online publication that's focused on defense policy and defense procurement. And I also write for the Center for European Policy Analysis, which is a think tank in DC. And then finally, a member of Tochny, which is a collaborative project that covers the war in Ukraine. So an awful lot there, but that kind of gives you a summary of what I'm up to with my writing.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, busy, doing a lot, but a lot of excellent work. And on the Insider, I saw there was the French have formally accused the GRU for some hacking and sabotage around the Olympics, right? Or was it
yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Definitely a lot going on there. Like you said with Havana syndrome, that you just read an article and you're just like, oh, that's dark. that's not a feel-good story at all. But yeah, interesting stuff. For I guess the first topic I kind of wanted to talk about here, obviously there's several different things. Of course, there's NATO and European rearmament, but with the United States kind of throwing tariffs all over the place, this is kind of impacting a lot of things. A lot of relationships in Europe, U.S.-Canada relations, everything. Just at kind of a broad strokes that we can kind of start off. What is a good, I guess, kind of orientation point with these tariffs on how they have impacted the U.S. relationship with, NATO and Canada, and how that's impacted their ability to secure arms sales effectively?
Yeah. Well, needless to say, these countries that are being subjected to these tariffs are not thrilled about that. And not because they have to pay the tariffs, really, because it's the American public that ultimately pays for the tariffs, because these companies just pass those costs off to the consumer. Of course, they're not going to just pay for those out of their own pocket, because most companies don't have the profit margin to just eat a massive tariff that could be up to 100% or whatever some of these insane figures were that were being floated initially. So across the board, it's obviously not a positive thing for America's relationship with friends and allies to be slapping these tariffs, which we know are entirely arbitrary as well. I mean, the way that the White House calculated them has been determined by the astute mathematicians that were looking at all the figures. So it's a slap in the face is how it's being taken, I would say, at least here in Canada and certainly other countries around the world. So it's not been productive for relations. And I mean, to add further sort of insult to injury is just the way that the administration and all of their supporters online are talking about the tariffs, where, it's all Calvin ball. The rules change every other day about what the purpose of the tariffs even is. One day it's, because the tariffs are great in and of themselves and they're going to bring back manufacturing to the United States. And then the next day it's all just about, it's a negotiation tactic. The tariffs, are just temporary and we're just looking to cut deals. So none of this makes any sense. Neither of these explanations have any sort of basis in reality. None of it makes zero sense. And if the goal, as some people are suggesting, is it's about China, well, why don't just put some tariffs on China alone and not have tariffs on all the other countries around the world that you should be friends with to work against the Chinese Communist Party? But that's not the course of action that they pursued. So it's not helpful. I would say that based on my conversations with industry and what industry in the United States defense industry has said publicly, is a lot of the firms are saying that the tariffs have not directly impacted them too much yet. You can not believe that. You can just say that that's sort of spin. But I mean, they have stated this on the record in the quarter one earnings calls, which just happened last week. I think it was pretty much all the big defense primes were having their earnings calls, and I listened to a few of them and sort of read what others were saying. And pretty much all these executives and this chief financial officers were basically saying that the tariffs haven't hurt them too much yet, although just today or yesterday I saw a headline, I think it was Oshkosh, said that they are expecting impacts from the tariffs, and I didn't look into it further to see exactly where they saw the impacts specifically. But I think it's safe to say that in one way or another, whether there's sort of a direct budgetary impact on these companies with regard to inputs that they might have, things that they're importing from overseas that are now subject to the tariffs, or just the general geopolitical impacts that are happening with the degradation in relations between the United States and allies and partners. Obviously, the tariffs are not good for American business interests whatsoever. And I've seen people trying to cherry pick, this company or that company. It's like, the tariffs are actually helping us. And yeah, of course, there's always, a couple winners here and there that may benefit from the tariffs. But overall, across the board, the average American and the average American business will be drastically worse off. And there's just countless examples from history where you can look at this, like with the steel tariffs that the Reagan administration had in the 80s. It's fairly obvious if you think about it, like what is larger, the United States steel industry or all of the industries in the United States that use steel? There should be a fairly obvious answer that companies that are using steel to make things is much larger than the U.S. steel industry itself. So if you're putting tariffs on steel, that might be good in the short term for American steel producers who might get more money for their product. But all the people that have to buy that steel are now paying vastly more, and that again goes down to the consumer, and companies can go out of business if they're suddenly paying drastically more for steel and they can't afford the increased price. So I'm not an economist, but you don't need to be to understand that tariffs are bad economic policy. Anybody who's read a basic textbook on economics, or just read Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, who's my favorite economist. He does a really great job of making this understandable and accessible, and using these great examples throughout history to explain why markets are a good thing, and it's generally good for the government to allow markets to work. And I would say that there's definitely a case for some limited industrial policy, I think, when it comes to real core national security interests around defense. But there's limits to this as well. And in general, it's good to be able to trade with other countries around the world and take advantage of the process of comparative and competitive advantage.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about just with this. I tend to think, or at least, of course, this is just my bias, that my timeline is fairly even. I try to follow folks from every part of whatever political spectrum you can imagine, just because I want to know what people are saying. It's interesting to me. And I don't think I've seen a single economist. I haven't seen a single person that works in defense or foreign policy, or very few people most people in politics, I should say, that has come to the defense of the tariffs. Everybody is saying, okay, this is a terrible idea. This is not going to end well. And on the measures of it, because I saw that the Q1 economic growth report came out, and the U.S. economy retracted by, what was it, like 0.3%, which still a retraction. That's not a good thing, and that's before the tariffs came in place. The tariffs came in place in Q2, right? So a lot of the measures that we're getting are lagging indicators, right? Like it's the impact will be felt before we actually get the measure in the on the ticker at the bottom of your Bloomberg terminal, right? So interesting times ahead. We'll see how it goes. Is there a risk to like the fulfillment of like already agreed to procurement contracts, whether that's within the United States or partnered with any other countries? Because just as using the F-35, very popular example, tons of inputs that come from abroad, and that's going to be a very interesting, I guess, case study on how much that price increased, because a lot of countries have already agreed to buy F-35s, but the delivery date is like next year, or like, it's a little bit into the future. Is there a risk to that? And how do you think that it'll impact those already inked deals, as well as any potential agreements in the future?
Yeah. So, on F-35, nobody is backing away from that specifically, to use it as an example. It's a popular example. So let's go with that, because there's an awful lot of information around this specific topic of F-35. So, Portugal was one of the first ones where people said, oh, the Portuguese have canceled their F-35 orders. Well, Portugal never ordered F-35 to begin with, so it's pretty hard for them to cancel an order that they never actually made. So what occurred is that the Portuguese government, or the Portuguese Air Force, has long said that they believe that F-35 is a necessity for the Portuguese Air Force, that they need new fighter jets. They're flying fairly old F-16s right now. They need to recapitalize their Air Force, their fighter fleet, and they think that F-35 is the best option. Really not, I shouldn't even say the best option, really the only option, is basically what they've said in the past, is that it's really the only aircraft that's going to meet all their requirements. Obviously interoperability would be a big concern there, because it's what a lot of other NATO countries are flying. So they believe that they want to go for F-35, and then there was a statement that oh well, we'll still maybe consider other aircraft. We won't take anything else off the table. But the requirements remain the same. And one of my colleagues at Defense Archives recently did a story on some new recent comments made by, it was either the Portuguese Chief of Defense Staff or the Chief of the Air Force, I forget which, but basically saying that, F-35 is still the aircraft that we believe that we absolutely need to be relevant for the future. So nothing has really changed there. The requirements haven't changed. The desire of the Air Force hasn't changed. What the politicians will do, maybe that'll end up being different. But if you ask me to bet, I would say that Portugal isn't going to be buying any aircraft, F-35 or otherwise, for the foreseeable future, just because of their budgetary challenges, where Portugal is not a tremendously wealthy country. They are not spending 2% of gross domestic product on defense right now. I don't believe I've seen a plan from them about, a credible plan, at least, about when that might happen. And they have obviously a lot of different modernization challenges, as any country that's not been meeting their spending targets for some time would have. So it's, I don't know where the money is going to come from, either for F-35 or all the other priorities that they have. So I would expect that in the short term, they're just going to continue to try and keep their F-16 fleet alive. And at some point in the future, if they feel that they have the budgetary resources, then F-35 sale would probably come into the cards then, and at which point President Trump will probably be gone, and who knows who will be in office at that point in time. But right now for Portugal, I see that they're probably not going to order anything, and so the political winds that we're seeing right now with a lot of people in Europe saying that we need to reevaluate our sources of supply and be less reliant on the United States. That'll probably, it may blow over by the time that Portugal is ready to proceed with the fighter acquisition. And then Canada is the other example where our government, and we just had an election, so the incumbent prime minister who just, I won't get into all the details, but the incumbent prime minister, had made some comments about needing to look elsewhere as well and reevaluate things, and perhaps we should consider different aircraft. And we've already made some initial payments for an initial batch, so maybe we just get those, and then the rest of the fleet we look elsewhere and operate a mixed fleet. Nobody in the Royal Canadian Air Force is going to be interested in that. Would be what I would posit there. These are smart professional people that understand that the F-35 is the aircraft that we need. A mixed fleet makes zero sense for Canada. Again, we're a country that is not meeting our obligations for defense spending. A mixed fleet is a unnecessary expense for us to undertake, and there's a lot of very clueless individuals who somehow think it would be cheaper for us to operate a mixed fleet because the alternative aircraft somehow would be cheaper when most of the alternatives are not in fact cheaper, or that their operating costs would be lower, which is very questionable. But ultimately, operating a mixed fleet means that you have two different sustainment pipelines, you have two different training pipelines. You're just duplicating so many different things, right? Like coming back to economics, there's something called economies of scale, right? Where, you go to your local bulk store and you buy something in bulk, it's typically cheaper. This works in procurement of defense articles and anything else in life, really. Like economies of scale is a thing. So it is advantageous to be using a lot of the same thing because it simplifies just sustainment for that asset. So a mixed fleet makes absolutely zero sense for Canada. It would be deeply injurious to our national security to cancel any portion of the F-35 order and opt for something else. And it would result in us getting that alternative way later on as well. Because if we're going to cancel this existing order that we have, and now we have to start a new procurement and bidding process and look at alternatives, this is all going to take years, if not decades, because Canada's procurement process is severely broken. So nothing happens fast. Like if we canceled an existing order that we're already spending money on, we're already dispersing funds to the US government for this foreign military sale, we would just be shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's Canada and Portugal. Nobody else is seriously looking at moving away from F-35. In fact, pretty much all the F-35 operators are releasing statements saying that we remain committed to the program. It's the best product. It's the product we need. We're not concerned about security of supply. We're not concerned about the reliability of the aircraft, that we're not going to be able to get parts for it, or that the U.S. government is suddenly going to turn them off. There is no kill switch. This is a myth. It's absurd on its face. You would never design a fighter jet to have the ability to remote in and turn it off externally, because that is a massive security vulnerability. And anybody in this space understands that the Russians and the Chinese actually have quite robust electronic warfare and offensive cyber capabilities. So you would never, ever build in that sort of glaring security vulnerability into any platform where it would give the opportunity for an adversary potentially to remote in and turn off your asset. Because if you have that capability, then the enemy can potentially exploit that feature. So it's not a thing. It doesn't exist, and then if you want to talk about the sort of the figurative kill switch through the sustainment, again, like this is just not, it's not going to happen. And what people need to understand about the F-35 is that the F-35 is not just an American fighter aircraft. It's a joint aircraft in more than one meaning of the word. So it's joint in the sense that it was designed to have these different variants the Air Force, for the U.S. Navy, for the Marine Corps, and similarly for other countries that have different services that with different requirements. But it's joined in the sense that there's so many different countries that are participants in the program in one fashion or the other. So F-35 has a global supply chain spanning countries around the world. Components are made in different countries. There's different levels of assembly that happen in different countries, right? Like Italy has an assembly facility, and in Germany, they're setting up a new center fuselage production line. So it's not just the American aircraft. The aircraft can't be built unless it has participation from all these program members. And we can see the huge headache that it created when the first Trump administration suspended and ultimately terminated Turkey's participation in the program. Turkey had significant work share, and they were the second source of those center fuselages, which are now being built in Germany. And if people want more on this, I wrote an article for Defense Archives on this topic. So cutting Turkey out of the supply chain for F-35, which is a decision that was made because Turkey bought the S-400 air defense system from Russia, that hurt the program a lot. It added a lot of additional cost to the aircraft because they had to find new sources of supply for all the components that Turkey was making, because it wasn't just the second source of fuselages. There were all sorts of other components that Turkey was responsible for producing, both in the fuselage and also engine components as well. So that delayed deliveries of those airframes, and it added cost to the unit cost of the airframes because of that additional cost that was incurred in standing up the new sources of supply. So the United States is not going to stop sustaining the aircraft for any operator, because those operators can turn around and cut off this flow of parts to build the aircraft and sustain the aircraft as well. It's a two-way street. So the program doesn't work unless everybody's committed to it and everybody's fulfilling their responsibilities that have been assigned by the Joint Program Office. So this is just not something that's going to happen. It would cripple the United States Department of Defense for them to take that step, because they would be losing their ability to produce and sustain aircraft for themselves as well. So if you see people suggesting that this is somehow something that could happen, that there's this risk with the F-35, that the supply chain will fall apart and Americans are going to cut everybody out of the program, it's not going to happen. It's like zero probability that this happens. So people should not be worried about that.
Yeah, the kill switch conversation has always been so funny to me, because it's like, this isn't Star Wars. There's no thermal exhaust port, to the Death Star here. That's a very silly thing to think that would happen. But I think it was Laura Loomer, of all people, that was posting some very anti-F-35 thread. And it's interesting, the individuals that are very anti-F-35, if we kind of go back in the history there. But it's just built on a complete misunderstanding of the platform. And if the F-35 was so bad, then why does everybody want to buy it? I think that's the market is such a good auditor of whether a product is good, especially on defense.
Right. And, Europeans in particular, some Europeans, I should say, have all sorts of conspiratorial ideas about how the United States has just forced countries to buy it and all of this, and I don't know, paying bribes, I guess. I don't know. I mean, Europe has pretty good anti-corruption laws, so I suspect it's probably not that the United States is bribing people to buy the aircraft. People just can't accept that maybe actually the aircraft is really good and it is just succeeding on its merits, and that it's the aircraft that people want to buy for very obvious reasons. Not to say that it's perfect. I mean, the problems with the program are extremely well documented. There's my friend and colleague Doha on Twitter does a really good job covering everything aviation, but F-35 in particular. And he is somebody that operates solely in the unclassified domain. So he's just reading the same reports that anybody else can read if they want to, but nobody bothers to, right? Nobody reads government reports except for a very small number of crazy people like myself and him. And so if you want to understand like what the legitimate problems and legitimate criticisms are to be had with the program, he's a great source. There's also the Engine Nerd. It's his handle is at the _NG_nerd, I think, on Twitter. He's somebody that also has a lot of really good insights into the F-35 program. On a more inside basis, I guess I can say. So if you're looking for information about F-35 from people that are more than willing to speak about the real challenges that it's had, go to them. But you're not going to find legitimate criticisms from most other people because they just don't have any understanding of the program. They haven't been following it. It's a program that's been around for a long time. So you need to have invested an awful lot into understanding the history of it to be offering those sort of comments about it.
Yeah, and I wonder if really a lot of the division over the F-35 kind of stems from how politicized its development was, just because, like everything, it went over budget. Everything goes under budget. Name a project that doesn't go over budget, and scope creep happens. These aren't necessarily good things, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad platform or that the end product is bad. It's just a thing that happens in complex, especially international projects. You got a bunch of people with different ideas for what they want it to be. That happens. I think that Bradley was like kind of an older example of a similar situation. So certainly not unprecedented. That's for sure.
Yeah.
We have a question here from Possum Nation. That's a cool name. Slava Ukraine, did Colby read the text of the mineral deal yet? I don't know anything but the headline about it.
So I don't know if the actual text of the agreement has been posted or not, but I do know that the Ukrainian official that was responsible for signing it, I think it's the deputy prime minister, I'm forgetting her name, but I just retweeted her thread that she wrote about it. So that's on my timeline right now. So if you want to understand more about it, I would encourage you to read her comments. I suspect that, what the Trump administration will say about it, there may be some differences in the way that they are interpreting things. And so that will need to be reconciled. But based on what we're seeing, it seems like that, they do have a real agreement and they've signed the deal. I don't know how things are going to play out in the future. There's obviously still a lot of work to be done in terms of implementation. But the Ukrainian, based on the Ukrainian government's comments so far, they seem to be pretty happy with how it has turned out. So I'm optimistic, I guess I can say about the future of that agreement, but time will tell, basically.
Yeah, just the little bit that I've seen about it so far, this revised version of it, it seems a lot more equitable than the first version was. The first was so lopsided, it was like, why would Ukraine sign that? That would be very silly.
Yeah. I mean, they couldn't. I mean, it just like legally speaking, some of the things that were being floated initially were just things that were just not constitutional in Ukraine. So you're asking them to sign a deal that they just wouldn't do anything for you because it's not something that they can actually agree to and enforce on their own people. So if you want to have a deal where the United States can actually accrue benefit, it does have to be a deal that is fully in compliant with both countries' laws. And it seems that they've come to a point where they've gotten there, where the deal is compatible with Ukraine's constitution and it can be ratified by the parliament, right? Because that's the other component, and this should be very obvious to the Trump administration that it should be obvious, but obviously it isn't, because there are certain obviously compromised individuals in the Trump administration that think that Zelensky's a dictator when he's not. He has a parliament as well, right? Same way that President Trump has a United States Congress that is a co-equal and separate branch, that he does not have total unilateral power in the United States. He has to work with Congress. There is a judicial branch in the United States as well. These are all separate co-equal branches of government. So Ukraine is the same thing. They have a judiciary, they have a parliament, and Zelensky has certain powers, and other things the Ukrainian Rada has to approve. So if they don't ratify this deal, which is basically a treaty, the same way the United States Senate has to ratify treaties in the United States, then it's not a workable deal. So,
yeah, to your point, just that this should have been obvious to the Trump administration. We just talked about tariffs. There's a lot of things that should have been obvious, right? But especially with Ukraine, I mean, it's bashing my head against the wall, but we're getting there. We're baby steps. Okay. We just got something good. We'll kind of get there, but
Yeah.
We got another question here from Dead War Dog. Are we seeing some faith eroding from the USA's FMS programs? Sure, existing contracts may be honored, but are there growing concerns about continuing support for old contracts and long-term planning? Big question.
Yeah. So, I mean, continued support for old contracts. I mean, if the contract's concluded, then the contract's concluded. If the contract is active, then it's active, and I would expect that the contract would be fulfilled. Is there faith eroding? I mean, certainly there are. People can see that there are lots of countries around the world that are publicly raising concerns about the reliability of the United States as a security partner in many different domains, not just as a supplier of weapons, but just as an ally in the case of NATO or countries that actually have formal alliances with the United States, and concerns about economic cooperation. Obviously, we were talking about tariffs. That is a major impediment to economic cooperation. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of concerns. What I can say is that I went and asked U.S. industry these questions beginning of last month in March. I was in Colorado for the U.S. Air Force Association conference, and I wanted to hear U.S. industry's perspective on this question. Are you seeing a shift from customers, particularly in Europe, but in elsewhere? And at the time, they were saying that, no, we haven't really seen anything. And even in advance of this, I was telling, kind of thinking and saying that there's a very obvious difference between what politicians say publicly for public consumption towards their domestic audiences, their constituents, and then what gets said behind closed doors, right? This is a very obvious thing in politics. Like, this is why so many people have a cynical attitude towards politics, because politicians, say one thing, do another, or what they say publicly in one room is different than what they might say privately in another room. Here in Canada, we have this problem where politicians will say one thing in English and then one thing in French, because we have two official languages. So, this shouldn't come as any surprise to people that what they are, might say for political consumption towards their constituents is going to be different than private conversations held behind closed doors, and that view is very much validated. That's not to say that this isn't real. Like, I definitely believe that there will be shifts in procurement decisions in Europe and elsewhere. But I think that it won't be as dramatic as some people have been thinking that it would be, just for practical realities, because for all sorts of different categories of equipment, the United States is kind of the only option in many respects. So you don't have something else that you can buy, right? There is no other F-35 option. Who else has a fifth generation multi-role stealth aircraft? Nobody in the West, at least, right? There's F-35, there's F-22, which is not available for export customers in any case, not in production anymore. The Russians have their fifth gen stealth platform, which is not very good, and based not really even in serial production either. And the Chinese have theirs, but Europe's not going to buy those. At least I don't think they will. If they're willing to, then that's a lot bigger problem than anything that Donald Trump is saying and doing. If countries are going to start buying from the Russians or the Chinese, I mean, if you want to talk about security of supply and kill switches, like, yeah, the Chinese will or the Russians will build that into an export model system, right? It won't be in theirs. But this is another thing, like F-35. I mean, it's the same aircraft that everybody's buying essentially. Export variants are a thing for most systems. Most countries have export variants of equipment because there are countries have laws about what technology is or is not allowed to be exported. So that's nothing unusual. But in the case of F-35, you're not getting some like severely downgraded product. It's basically the same aircraft that everybody's flying. So there's I think that depending on how the tariff issue continues to develop and the overall policy direction of the Trump administration, we could see some serious damage to the United States arms sales, not just foreign military sales, but direct commercial sales as well. Both will be hurt if poor relations continue either because of tariffs or just other policy decisions. So there is definitely risk there. But I think there's still time to basically mitigate and avert most of that. Not all. I think that based on what's happened so far, examples that I like to use are the air defense procurements that Denmark and Norway have. They're both in the market for higher order air defense. And basically the only options there are Patriot or SAMP-T, which is the Franco-Italian system. And whereas before all of this, I would have given the edge to Patriot winning both of those tenders. Afterwards, I think that there's a good chance that we see SAMP-T win those two. So that's one example, but we're talking about like 2, 3, maybe 4 fire units or batteries maximum here. So fairly modest impact in the grand scheme of things. We'll see how this plays out as it relates to other systems. But again, the United States is the only option for a lot of different things, and European efforts to develop their own defense industry and develop options. This is all very good and very important, but the point that I'm often making is that they need to be very smart about this and not bite off more than they can chew and not spread themselves too thin, because we still see that Europe has got severe issues with actually putting up the money. We can see that countries like the Baltics and the Nordic states are all pretty serious about the threat that Russia poses and are taking real steps to increase defense spending. But the major economies on the continent are still really big laggards, even if they're meeting 2%. 2% stopped being adequate a long time ago. 3 years ago, 2% stopped being adequate. And we still see countries like France, just right around 2%. UK is still just right around 2%. Germany barely meeting 2% through their special fund. Germany is an interesting case because they seem to have come to an agreement on sort of the debt break and being able to get more defense spending made available. But the dollars haven't been approved by Parliament yet, so we have to wait and see. So until Europe gets more serious about actually putting money up, they just don't have the funds to create a more robust defense industry. So I'll be the first to say that this is something they should do, but it needs to be much more strategic than a lot of people are thinking right now. They need to invest in more targeted capabilities where they can realize gains on a shorter timeline. They shouldn't be trying to be totally self-sufficient in everything, because it's just not possible. The United States isn't totally self-sufficient in all of its defense needs. As I said, F35 is a global program. They have partners. The United States military buys things from abroad as well. They have co-production agreements and joint projects, and obviously in terms of just raw materials, rare earth minerals, a lot of this is coming from abroad. So nobody can do it alone. It's better to have friends. It's better to work together. And I would advocate very strongly for deepening defense industrial cooperation rather than siloing ourselves off and saying, buy American, buy European, we should stop working together. That's the wrong model. We need to work through the disagreements and the tensions and try and deepen our relationships rather than taking our ball and going home to play by ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. For the contracts that are already being executed or might be in the queue, right? But the price point has already been agreed to. What kind of impact will the tariffs have on those contracts? Does the cost get passed to the country that's buying, even though they've already agreed to a figure, or does the manufacturer eat the cost?
Yeah, so this is a very complicated question. So it all depends on the terms of the contract, and the actual terms of the contract are not typically public in most cases. So these are details that, I'm sure and certainly should be all worked out. What happens in terms of price fluctuation, because that happens just naturally, regardless of tariffs happening. The price of a commodity goes up and suddenly you're paying a lot more for something. In most cases, the manufacturer just has to deal with that. That's how things usually happen in industry. I can say, having worked in manufacturing on the sales side, not in defense, just in commercial. If you sign a contract with a customer and say, like, yeah, we'll make this for you, it's going to cost X. If suddenly it's going to cost you a lot more, typically you just kind of have to eat that on your end. And if your assumptions are incorrect about what it's going to cost you to source raw materials or components are wrong, that's a mistake that you made. And so you have to be diligent when you're putting together a bid for a customer, that you're making sure that you're giving yourself enough room to make profit margin, accounting for all the fluctuations in all of the inputs, whether it's labor or it's power rates for your factory. These are all things that industry have to deal with. So it's complicated because, the terms of the contracts, may or may not have different provisions than what's typical on the commercial side. And the foreign military sales program introduces a layer of complexity to that. And in general, I would say the way the FMS program is designed is that it moves all of the risk actually sort of onto the U.S. government, away from the customer. So that's why it's attractive to some customers, is that you're not signing a contract directly with the manufacturer. You're making a contract with the U.S. government, and the U.S. government's responsible for executing the contract with the manufacturer and delivering what's being requested. So if there's a problem, it's not actually really your problem; it's the U.S. government's problem. So it really depends. Is this a foreign military sales contract? Is it a direct commercial sale? It'll be variable, and there's a question as well, I guess, of, do the tariffs apply to things that companies are importing for defense purposes? Because there's all sorts of international supply agreements around that, separate from sort of commercial free trade deals that countries have about sourcing these materials. So there's a whole lot of complexity there, and I'm not an international trade lawyer, and I haven't read all those agreements. Some of them may or may not be public. Usually there's sort of a high level summary, at least, of made available of those. I know during the Biden administration, they expanded agreements with a lot of countries. They're called, was it Security of Supply Agreement, I think is what they're called. So a bit long way of saying this is very complicated. There's no easy answer that I can give to that question, but it just kind of reinforces why the uncertainty created by the tariffs is just not good, even if the impacts aren't as severe as they could be. And I'll reiterate again that on the earnings calls, a lot of the execs were saying that they haven't had any catastrophic impacts yet, and people are welcome to go listen to those earnings calls for themselves and hear what was said, because there were definitely a lot of questions being asked about the tariffs. So there's information there that people want, if they want to learn more about it. I would say go straight to the source. Don't take it from here. You can listen to what those execs are saying and evaluate their comments for yourself and see whether you trust that or not.
I know we've been kind of using the F35 as kind of like an example, right? Another famous platform, especially for the war in Ukraine, is HIMARS. And I saw, I think it was today actually, that the French announced that they're going to build kind of their own competitor for HIMARS. I know that the Brits and the Italians are working on, I believe it's those two, that are working on a 5th generation fighter.
Next generation.
Some European, next generation. Okay, got it.
6th
generation.
Yeah,
okay,
so there's GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program. So that's the United Kingdom and Italy and Japan. And then there's also FCAS, Future Combat Air System. I think, don't quote me on the acronyms. And that one is like Germany and France, and I think Spain as well. So those are Europe's 6th generation fighter aircraft programs, and more than a fighter aircraft as well. Like they're sort of, these are all like family of system concepts basically, and it's the same for the United States. Like within next generation air dominance, like there's other components. Like the main one that is like actually real and moving forward is CCA, Collaborative Combat Aircraft, right? So this is the idea of having unmanned aerial systems, drones accompanying the manned fighters. So the manned fighters are going to have a group of these CCA drones flying alongside with them, basically to sort of expand the magazine depth of the fighter. So you just have a platform that's just carrying a bunch of air-to-air missiles, so that it's not just one fighter with its own arsenal. It's got all these drones that it's using as well, and the drones could maybe be out in front and sort of screen and keep the man fighter alive. So the European programs are kind of going in the same direction, based on my understanding, is that they're thinking along the same way. And then there's the question of sort of next generation refueling aircraft as well to go along to keep them sustained at long operating ranges. So Europe has those programs, and my opinion is that GCAP is the one to bet on, that would be more likely to be actually successful and realized.
So I know that these aren't obviously the same as the F-35, like you've described, six fighter, whole different kind of platform, right? And since they're still in the conceptual phase right now, right, that I understand, these are probably like 2030s at the earliest, probably 2040s or 50s, right, in terms of deployment. Is there, I guess, a belief in Europe, or a growing belief with what's going on here in the United States and the added tariffs, just that the U.S. can kind of shift policy positions at any point, and it can make procurement a little bit more complicated? Maybe not as complicated as we thought, based on what we've been discussing so far. That it might be a more feasible or better sustainable option to just domestically, or I guess locally in Europe, manufacture or produce their own next generation aircraft or platforms, including the French HIMARS competitor. With that, are they kind of seeing that might be a better long-term option? So fill in the gap with whatever you can with, like, say, F-35 or HIMARS, but long-term kind of try to shift away from U.S. manufacturing and products and just build it yourself effectively.
Yeah. So, with these 6th generation programs, these have all been around for a long time. So this is not anything that's being undertaken in response to any sort of recent policy shift that we've seen out of the Trump administration, or even concerns that were present with the Biden administration, because there were definitely lots of concerns being raised back then as well, just because they were putting all sorts of strings onto the weapons that were being provided to Ukraine. And so some people were raising the question, like, well, what if the Americans do the same thing to us? And they say, oh, well, you can have this, but you can't use it to shoot at Russia, because that would be too provocative. And what people need to understand is that there's a very big difference between getting something as grant assistance and then buying it yourself. Because if you get something as grant assistance, the person that's giving it to you has a lot of leverage over you, because you're just getting something for free. So they have the ability to basically dictate to you, you need to do this or not do this with what we're giving you, because if you don't, then we're not going to give you any more. So Ukraine was in a position where they had to adhere to whatever terms and conditions the Biden administration was imposing on them, because if they didn't, they weren't going to get more help. That was the message that they were getting. If you're buying something on your own with your own money, it's totally different. Yes, there's still end user license agreements. That's typical for any country that's selling any weapon. That's just a given, that you make them say that, yeah, we won't use this weapon to commit war crimes or things of that nature. But if you're buying something, it's with the understanding that you can use it for lawful purposes. So if the Russians invade you, you're shooting back. And obviously in the case of NATO, like, the understanding is that we're all in this together. If Russians actually attack, we're fighting back together. And if we're not, then that's a whole bigger problem. So that's an important distinction that needs to be made. On the question again of European independence and sovereign defense industry, and not being reliant on the United States. Again, like, Europe needs a more robust defense industrial base. That's absolutely in the interest of both Europe and the United States and everybody else. The United States has been, complaining for decades now that Europe isn't pulling its own weight. So, contrary to popular belief, the United States would be happy if Europe spent more money on defense, even if that means investing in their own capabilities. Obviously, they want them to buy certain things from the United States as well. But this comes back to my point that this should all be done intelligently, and we should be deepening defense industrial cooperation, not siloing ourselves off. So rather than the French model, where the French idea is that we want to just do everything absolutely ourselves, and we don't want to be reliant on anybody. This doesn't make sense in defense industry. It doesn't make sense in just general economics. No country is better off by closing themselves off to trade and sourcing everything on their own. The USSR tried to do that. Communist countries try to do that. Doesn't work. They still end up, having to trade at least a little bit with other countries, and they'd be a lot better off if they traded more. Right. This is why the West won the Cold War, is because actually capitalism is a lot better. Free markets work in general terms, especially when you're trading with other people in good faith. Right. So, the China example is a case where the trade was never actually in good faith. But if you're going to trade with, your friend and ally in good faith, and both of you approach that with good intentions, but by definition, everybody's better off, because if you weren't going to be better off, then you wouldn't sign the trade deal. So when it comes to defense, I really like the partnerships that Lockheed Martin has with Raytheon, that Lockheed Martin has with Rheinmetall, the partnerships that Raytheon has with MBDA. I think that these agreements are models for what should be done, because it makes absolutely no sense for Europe to sink billions of dollars into R&D to try and develop their own systems, complex systems, when there is a readily available American alternative that they can and should just buy now, because they don't have time to invest years and billions in developing new systems, and then not have any money left over to actually buy those systems that they're going to need to fight a war with Russia. Because we can see Russia continues to reconstitute throughout this war. They're still recruiting large numbers of forces. They're actively modernizing their strategic forces still. They're not by any means putting all of their efforts into the war in Ukraine. They are actively still engaging globally on the global playing field. They're active in Africa still. They're active all around the world. They're taking a very wide, holistic view of this. And even though obviously a lot of resources are going into Ukraine, they're not totally neglecting other theaters and other modernization needs that they have for their armed forces. So Europe can't be sleeping here and can't be wasting money on vanity projects. They need to be smart about this. So again, good examples of cooperation: F-35 fuselages in Germany. Good. Lockheed Martin's work with Rheinmetall as well on missile production. They signed a deal today furthering their existing MOU on the production of rocket motors and missiles. And there's talk about both potential in offensive fire, so MFOM, MLRS family of munitions, that's Gimlers, Gimlers, ATACMS, PRSM, and then also air defense. So there's potential there for maybe PAC-3 MSC production between Lockheed and Rheinmetall. Raytheon already is partnered with MBDA Germany on producing PAC-2. They're standing up a production line in Germany. There's 1,000 missiles on contract through the NATO Support and Procurement Agency for a number of different European Patriot operators. So these are all really good examples of how Europe can leverage all of this existing American technology that many of them are already using and operating, and introducing the ability within their countries to make these systems locally now. So that's good for both the United States and Europe, because the United States doesn't have as much production capacity as they're going to need if they get into a war with China. So if Europe is there and able to build these missiles as well, it's good for everybody. So those are the kind of agreements that I think need to be pursued, rather than saying we'll just develop something from scratch on our own and spend a lot of time and money on that. So the French proposal of their own indigenous MLRS system, which is something they've been talking about for a year, and now there's this new firm that is coming up with another proposal as well. And the funny thing about this, though, is that apparently there was a media report that this company actually said that the launcher module for this vehicle is going to be compatible with Lockheed Martin and the U.S. Army's MFOM MLRS family of munitions, which is very interesting if that's the case. So something that I'll be asking Lockheed about is, have they already licensed this? Because that would be a pretty new development if they had secured a license or an MOU in principle to do that. Because right now it just seems to be Rheinmetall that sort of has that agreement with Lockheed. So, but that this would defeat the purpose of what the French government is ostensibly trying to do, is that if it's going to be compatible with American MLRS family of munitions, then you don't have a system that is totally sovereign, quote unquote, and indigenous. So, if they go that route, I would say, yeah, that's the correct route. That's what Rheinmetall and Lockheed Martin are proposing. They are proposing something called GMARS instead of HIMARS. So German Mars, German multiple artillery rocket system. So it's what it is it's two pods like on the tracked M270 vehicle, which is what a lot of European operators, including France and Germany, already had from the Cold War. Two pods instead of the one on HIMARS on a German truck. So it would be like HIMARS, but it would have twice the firepower because it's a slightly larger truck, I guess, and can accommodate two of those instead of one. So that's Rheinmetall's proposal. And again, this is the correct model, is that, take a German truck and then put those American designed pods on the back, and you can produce them locally in Germany. And now you have a European built system with American technology, but it's European built, European supply chain. And you're going to be able to stand production of that up a lot faster than if you have to develop something totally from scratch with its own munition suite from scratch as well. Because this is an expensive proposition if you're going to design that totally from scratch, because nobody's doing that. Because the alternative is either you're buying South Korean, right? So you're not, that's the alternative that some countries in Europe have opted for. Poland obviously is buying a lot of stuff from South Korea. The Israelis have a MLRS system as well, and some countries in Europe have opted for that. But South Korea and Israel are actually really funny examples when I see that, instead of buying American, we'll buy from these two countries. South Korea obviously had a attempted coup not too recently, and pretty much almost every government in Europe is of the legal opinion that the Israeli government are a bunch of war criminals that should be brought in front of the International Criminal Court. So I find it very interesting that there are people in Europe that think that, especially in the case of Israel, that they go, well, we'll just buy from Israel. It's like, you're going to buy from a country where you believe that there are a bunch of war criminals, or you're going to buy from the guys that just had a coup attempt. And South Korea has a very lengthy history of coups in the past. Obviously, they've become much more stable in recent years, but they have that history, and we can see that there was just an attempt happen. So the idea that these alternatives are somehow more secure politically or geopolitically stable, more reliable partners, it's very interesting to me. And the same is true of the Canadian government as well, because there's people here is making the same suggestion that, we're not going to buy American, so we'll buy something else from South Korea or maybe Israel, because our government is also ostensibly of the position that the Israelis are a bunch of war criminals and again, coup in South Korea. So the United States has got plenty of problems, but I still rate them as much more reliable partners for defense industrial cooperation, especially because both South Korea and Israel for the past 3 years have been pretty uncooperative on the question of third-party transfers to Ukraine, right? So Israel was not allowing countries that had bought their weapons to send those on to Ukraine. And obviously there's been some positive developments with that in the last few months, with back in January, as the Biden administration was out the door, negotiating a deal for some limited supply of Patriot missiles to Ukraine. But for the most part, them and South Korea have been pretty uncooperative on that question. So you're not going to see Poland handing over its arsenal of South Korean hardware to Ukraine, because South Korea, as far as we can see, is not willing to allow that to happen. So countries have to be careful here if they are thinking that they're going to stock up on Israeli or South Korean equipment and then have the ability to to transfer that equipment to Ukraine or elsewhere, because both of them are way worse on this question than the United States, for all their faults. And the Biden administration had to be kicking and screaming into this position. But ultimately, they, for the most part, approved all these third-party transfer requests. We know the saga of F-16s. They were against it for a long, long time, but ultimately they did relent. So overall, a very large number of these requests have been honored ultimately by the U.S. government and continue to be honored by the U.S. government. So if you have an American origin defense system and you want to give it to Ukraine, you're probably going to be able to give it to Ukraine. Overall, with the understanding of we all saw the history of the high profile cases, but overall, an awful lot of stuff has been given. And so people should be very cautious about thinking that somehow Israel or South Korea are more reliable than the United States, because it's not supported by the evidence.
Yeah, and I mean, I've got so many extra questions, but we are coming up on time. I don't want to hold you too late. But I think that is such a good, or I guess very interesting kind of cap to put on everything, that it seems pretty bad here in the United States, just with how fast the news is going and everything that's happening. But like you said, just to put it in context, Israel's got some things going on. South Korea just had some things going on. So as bad as it seems, folks are still looking at the United States to be a very stable partner, even into the future, even in the context of what all is going on. I think it kind of, if I were to put it in a bottom line or kind of summarize everything we've talked about, it's not as bad as it looks. Where it's like, okay, the tariffs impacting foreign military sales, not as bad as it looks. The tariffs and the political stuff impacting, European trust in the United States to help them out with NATO, not as bad as it looks. It's, cooler heads are, prevailing in some areas. So I think that's an encouraging way to kind of wrap it up here. What say you on that?
Yeah, no, sure. And at the same time, things can obviously get a lot worse as well. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and President Trump is unpredictable to say the least. So by no means am I making any prediction that we're going to have sunny ways or anything of that sort. But I try and not be too hyperbolic. Emotions overcome the best of us, including myself. But I try and be as analytical about it as I can, and look at the facts and not draw too many wild conclusions. Again, we all make mistakes and slip up, but based on everything that's happening so far, I don't think it's as bad as a lot of the fiery rhetoric that we see in public discourse on social media from all sides. Everybody's guilty of saying things that are inflammatory and probably shouldn't be said. And I think that what's being said behind closed doors is often different. Yeah.
Well, knock on wood, it stays not as bad. Maybe it gets a little bit better. And it doesn't just, hard turn, just go crazy, right? Colby, thank you for jumping on. Thank you for letting your time, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts. This has been just fascinating, very enlightening. There's a lot of this that I did not know, and it's been very handy for me to learn about. And I hope that everybody watching has also been able to get a lot from this as well.
Well, thank you again for inviting me on. I've enjoyed the conversation, and happy to come back anytime if it's of interest to you or your audience. Happy to take more questions. So just let me know.
Absolutely. I mean, these extra questions I've inked up could fill a whole other hour. So that'll definitely have to happen. Everybody that's on, thank you for joining, and I will see you all next week.